Don't we go to heaven or hell directly when we die? Aren't my loved ones who have died now living in heaven with the angels and Jesus? Didn't Jesus promise the thief on the cross he would be in heaven that day? And what about the story of the rich man and Lazarus? And didn't Paul say he wanted to depart and be with Jesus? Let me answer these questions from a biblical perspective. Jesus wanted to be very clear to us when he's going to take us to heaven, and he says it in John chapter 6. This is what it says in verse 39 and 40. This is the will of my Father who has sent me, that of all he has given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. That's clear, isn't it? Jesus spells it out, that the resurrection of the dead who die in Christ are raised at the last day, not before then. In fact, Paul reiterates this idea in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. In fact, verse 14 and 15 describe people who have died as sleeping in Jesus. Verses 16 and 17 describe Jesus coming down as the second coming. There's a shout from the archangel of God and the trumpet, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then those who are alive and remain are caught up together with those who have died and been risen to be with the Lord forever from that point. And this idea of sleeping, Jesus reiterates in John chapter 11, verse 11. Jesus is going to his friend Lazarus, but he's delaying because he said he's going to wake him up. His disciples ask, well, if you're going to wake him up, isn't he going to wake up by himself? Then Jesus says plainly to them in verse 14, Lazarus is dead. I guess the other thing to point out is that Lazarus never complained about being pulled out of the pearly gates when he got woken up 3 days later after being dead. So he didn't go to heaven. John 11:25, Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, shall live. Future tense. Now let's look at the words that Jesus used when he spoke to the thief on the cross. Luke 23:43 says, Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Now it sounds very convincing that Jesus said that he's going to be in paradise with this thief on that very day. However, this is not what happened. In John 20 verse 17, 2 days later after he died on the Friday, Jesus said to Mary, Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. All you have to do is move the comma before the word today or after the word today. It changes the whole meaning of the text. But when you take everything in context, you find where the comma should be, because in the original Greek and Hebrew there was no commas, so the interpreters had to just guess where to put it. And here we can see reading in context helps us determine exactly where the comma should be. Just remember that the punctuation was never inspired, it was the words of the Bible that were inspired. The punctuation was put in by the translators years later. Now, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus told to correct misunderstandings to the Jewish people. So in this story, the beggar, Lazarus, ends up in heaven, and the rich man ends up in Hades or hell. The first misunderstanding Jesus wanted to convey was the Jews thought that they were assured of going to heaven. The second was that being rich simply meant that God was smiling on them and it was God's favour. So Jesus corrected their view by picturing a rich Jew who goes to hell. The Jews believed that Gentiles were no better than dogs, and they also believed that being poor was a sign of God's curse. So Jesus pictures a poor beggar who goes to heaven. As far as the original Jewish hearers were concerned, this was a preposterous idea. And if we see this parable as something to take literally, we have to believe this idea that heaven and hell are close enough for people to talk back and forth and see each other's faces. The core of this parable is in the very last verse of the chapter. Verse 31 says this, But he said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. Basically, Jesus is saying, you have to believe Moses and the prophets. If you don't believe them, there's nothing left for you. Now Paul says this in Philippians chapter 1 and verse 23 and 24, "For I am hard pressed between two places, having the desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you." To understand Paul in context, let's read him in context. 2 Timothy 4 verse 7 and 8, Paul says this, "I have fought the good fight, I have finished the race, I have kept the faith. Finally, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will give me on that day, and will not only give to me, but also to all who loved his appearing." So clearly we can see that Paul is looking forward to the future. He's looking forward to the second coming of Jesus. For all who love his appearing will get a crown on that day.